So first I'm going to read an excerpt from the second chapter of the book. The image of British Member of Parliament Mavis Tate flickers onto the screen. I, as a Member of Parliament, visited Buchenwald concentration camp with 9 others, she opens. Some people believe that the reports of what happened there are exaggerated. Cut to stacks of emaciated bodies in the back of a truck. No words could exaggerate, Tate clarifies. We saw and we know. A man attempts to shovel out charred skeletons from industrial ovens. The reality was indescribably worse than the pictures. Tate concluded with the ominous admonition, let no one say these things were never real. When the projection stopped in this small theater in northwest London in 1945, Morris Beckman and his cousin Harry Rose filed out into the lobby. Newsreels like this showed the world a sliver of Nazi terror, but it wasn't really until the 1970s that the Holocaust began to be perceived by both scholars and the general public as an historical event of major importance. But for Jews like Beckman and Rose, however, the horror could not be more palpable. They knew what post-war newsreels did not say, that most of the twisted corpses on the screen had belonged to adoring Jewish daughters, lovingly eccentric Jewish fathers, tough as nails Jewish grandmothers who gave a wry smile every time they recounted surviving the pogroms of their youth. Beckman and Rose didn't need to hear that from Mavis Tate. They were all too aware. They felt sick to their stomachs seeing bodies like skeletons covered with skin. Both Rose and Beckman had served in the war. Beckman was a radio operator in the Merchant Marine, and Rose was in a unit that had fought behind Japanese lines in Burma. As Jewish veterans, Nazism could not have been more personal. And so, as they walked home from the theater, they could not have been more appalled by what they saw. A former 18B detainee, which in Britain was someone who was imprisoned during the war for having Nazi sympathies, was on a platform shouting, "Not enough Jews were burned at Belsen." Not enough Jews were burned at Belsen. I can't believe it, Rose exclaimed. Still in his uniform and medals, he complained to a nearby police officer who just shrugged his shoulders and walked away. Well, I'll get the bastard, Rose said, but Beckman held him back, fearing arrest. But isn't anybody going to do anything about this, he asked. Over the next few years, the members and sympathizers of the approximately 14 fascistic groups in London and equivalent groups elsewhere orchestrated poster campaigns around the city with slogans like "Jews must go" and "War on the Jews." They attacked people in Jewish neighborhoods, they attempted to burn down synagogues, and they even threw petrol bombs into a trade union meeting. Not long after holding back his cousin from attacking a fascist speaker, Morris Beckman and 3 fellow Jewish veterans came upon another fascist meeting, this time run by the British League of Ex-Servicemen and Women. That day, Geoffrey Ham, formerly of the British Union of Fascists of Oswald Mosley, was denouncing the, quote, aliens in our midst who profited while our boys fought overseas. The Jewish veterans had enough. This group of 4, which included a judo expert, formerly of the Welsh Guards, a former Royal Air Force pilot, Beckman and another veteran spread out into the crowd of 60. As the judo expert pretended to buy copies of the League newspaper, he suddenly smashed the heads of the 2 fascist stewards together, and Beckman and the others toppled the stage, dispersing everyone. Beckman later explained that the sheer malevolence of the speaker had moved him and his comrades to physically shut down a post-war fascist meeting for the first time. It would not be the last. This direct action sparked the formation in March 1946 of the 43 Group, a militant anti-fascist organization composed mainly, but not entirely, of Jewish British veterans dedicated to shutting down fascism through direct action and pursuing legislation against racist incitement. The 43 Group commando units had several methods of disrupting outdoor fascist meetings. If a single member could get through the line of fascist stewards to tip over the speaker's platform, the police had a rule of not allowing the fascists to set it up again. With that in mind, the group organized units of about a dozen into wedge formations. They would start out at an agreed time far away from the speaker, build up enough steam so that their units could break through many times more their number of fascists and get to the platform. If the platform was too well guarded, however, the commandos would disperse into the audience, start fights, start arguments, to the point where the disorder forced the police to shut down the event. Another method was to jump the pitch by occupying fascist meeting spaces before they could set up. By the summer of 1946, the 43 group was attacking 6 to 10 fascist meetings per week. And as an aside, let's step back and realize that in 1946, there were 6 to 10 fascist meetings a week in London. Beckman estimates that about a third were disrupted by the 43 group, about a third were ended by the police, and about a third continued. After a while, the 43 group became so popular that some locals would even shut down fascist meetings using the same tactics on their own. With the emergence of the, quote, fucking hard-cased East End Yids, as the black shirts called them, the, quote, keep your head down and get indoors quickly mentality had gone for good. So there's a lot of things that we can take out of this example, the example of the 43 group in post-war London. The 43 group formed in 1906 only lasted a few years because after a while the fascist threat had been at least relatively pushed into the darkness. But we can see a few things. One, fascism is dangerous even when it's small. If you read historians talking about the 1940s in London, they'll say, yeah, there were some far-right groups, but overall, in this perspective of British politics, they were trivial. They weren't important. But if you read testimonies of people who were afraid to walk out their front doors because they were fascists who were potentially going to attack them, who were targeting their places of worship, you can see that even in small doses, fascism is incredibly important. And we can see that for the 43 group, it was important to respond to it. What else can we learn? Well, I think that we can also learn that resistance is contagious. That after a while, the 43 group didn't even have to always lead the charge. That locals were empowered by the example of their direct action. We can also see that you can't always trust the majority to look out for the interests of minorities. The most of British society was not really concerned with what these fascists were doing to Jewish people. They had won the war, they were moving on. Right? So we can talk about it more later, but I think anti-fascism is a really interesting lens to think through the complexities of popular politics and think through what it means to resist when most people in society aren't necessarily sympathetic to what your plight is. And we can see that, at least in this case, anti-fascism can work. Throughout the media coverage of the whole Antifa question, the question always is analyzed in the abstract. How many pundits from Politico or CNN ever really take the time to read into these examples? If they did, they'd see there actually are a ton of examples of consistent direct action campaigns stopping the advance of white supremacists and fascists. And I think that from a common sense perspective, if you think of how hard it is to organize movements, how hard it is to organize politics in general, if there are people who are trying to physically disrupt you at every turn, that's going to make it even harder, and it certainly did in this case.